All right, let's try this again. Today's lecture is gonna be about World War One. I think what I need to make clear from the get go is World War One's kind of this interesting thing where um, American troops play a pretty small role in this conflict, and in fact, I would argue, sort of unfortunately, that American troops get involved at the very end of the war, and you can read sort of German accounts of their encounters with American troops, and they sort of laugh at how terrible they are. Um, but what's relevant is that like the support that they offer at the very end of the wars is just sort of like they provide sort of like cannon fodder at the critical juncture of the war as the Germans are trying to make one last push to win the war before sort of suing for peace. Um, what really is important during World War One is not necessarily like the fighting side of it for at least American history. Now, world history is a different story, but for American history, what's really important is like the changes that World War One causes in our government, in the way that the sort of government interacts with the people during wartime, um, and sort of secondarily, I mean, you could argue maybe more importantly, um, it has a tremendous effect on American economics, and um, you could argue. I mean, there's something like over like 1,000 new millionaires and billionaires were made in the United States during World War One. So the sort of financial effects of World War One are a huge boon for the United States. All right, so if we sort of moving on, if we look at sort of like what caused World War One and why the United States entered the war, the causes of World War One are really easy to remember because there's four main causes. All right, like when I say four main, I sort of use it like MAIN. So it's militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. Okay, and that's the easy way to remember it. So hopefully, from your world history class, you have some sort of background in that, and we'll kind of briefly go through this. Uh, but what we'll see is that the United States is going to sort of attempt to remain neutral, um, but what's good because of some sort of purposeful decisions and some things that were out of the sort of America's hands, we're going to eventually start aiding the Allies, so like Britain and France, much more than we are Germany, and that's going to have certain repercussions and sort of be the cause of like eventually we're going to get dragged into the conflict. Um, all right, so if we look at these different things, like I said, these if you look at these, like I said, there are four main causes, all right? So like MAIN, and we went through those. I think the other thing that you should throw in there is economic rivalries, and a lot of that has to, I mean, that ties into other different things. So the economic rivalries had a lot to do with nationalism, had a lot to do with imperialism. These alliances that develop are going to be important here, and we'll talk about each of these as we kind of go through them. So like nationalism, and nationalism just kind of like another word for like patriotism. What we see during the late 1800s and early 1900s is a huge growth of in imperial or in nationalism. Sorry, um, and that this sort of nationalism grows not only in Europe and in many European countries, but also in America as well. And so this like nationalism or like love of one's country is really a recent thing. I mean, only in the last like 150 years, maybe 175 years, have we really seen people talk about being German or being French, and then that really mattering and meaning something as a nation, and that like being French is different than being German, and one makes you better than the other. So that's a pretty recent thing, and obviously, I mean, I think in many ways that's probably to the detriment of humanity that we've decided that being German is different than being French, and being American is different than being Canadian, and so on. Second, here we go, economic competition for both trade and colonies. is only going to make these relationships between European countries worse. So not only do they like start to see each other differently, but then they really start to be competitive about those differences, and they're trying to increase wealth with that competition and power. And that kind of ties into this next point, which is militarism. And so, like, in order to, prove you're the best and the strongest, part of that was like to build up your army and navy. And you can see, like, from the graph here that what really happens is that, like, Germany and Britain are the two probably biggest sort of most powerful countries at this time, as we're sort of leading into World War One. But we, we start to see that the effects of industrialization on war too, because what's going to happen is that as industrialization happens and as new technologies are developed, those new technologies are going to sort of filter their way into war. And countries really start to stockpile these new types of automatic weapons, machine guns. They're going to start to stockpile tanks. Germany, for example, starts to develop a submarine that's really hyper effective. And they start to also build airplanes that they can utilize as weapons. And so, like, I know, for example, like Britain had, and kind of show you like this competition side of it, Britain literally had a law leading up to World War One that said that the British Navy had to be bigger than the next two biggest navies in the world combined at all times, and that was like a law. So like no matter what changed, the British Navy was essentially always growing. And so like I said, like Britain and Germany are really the two countries that get into this like arms race leading up to World War One. That really kind of primes the world for a big conflict. If we look at like what the sort of immediate trigger is for the war, this is it right here. Okay, so I would make a mental note of this, that what's really going to cause the war to start is the Archduke of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which Archduke's essentially like another word for a prince. So like this guy, this Franz Ferdinand or Francis Ferdinand, however you want to translate it, was the prince of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which at that point had sort of been in power since the Habsburgs had been in power since basically late Middle Ages, and in early Renaissance. And so like this family had been in power in here. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was a huge and an important empire in Europe. And so what's going to happen is that Serbian nationalists who wanted to create an independent Serbia and sort of break off from the Austro-Hungarian Empire and break away, like create an independent state, they went and they for all Serbians, they went and assassinated this prince. And what happens is that like immediately with this assassination is that we'll talk about this here in a second, but like these alliance system that had developed in Europe is going to turn what probably should have been like this small conflict between two countries over an assassination of a politician into this big world war. And you can kind of see it right here is that like what's going to happen is that Austria-Hungary and Serbia are going to essentially start to be in conflict with one another. And what happens is that Russia tells Serbia like, "Hey, we got your back no matter what," and then what happens is that Germany tells Austria-Hungary that they got their back no matter what. When Russia had an agreement with France, and so that kind of pulled France into the conflict. And what then we'll see is that Germany decides to sort of invade France through Belgium, and Belgium had an alliance with Britain, and so that pulled Britain into this conflict. And so, like I said, what very likely should have been a small localized conflict between Austria and Serbia ends up being this huge global conflict as all these other nations get tied into the conflict because of these alliances. And you can see this political cartoon here that kind of makes fun of this, with Serbia being attacked by Austria, then Russia attacking Austria, then Germany attacking Russia, then France attacking them, and so on. So again, I mean, I'm not going to go too deep into detail with that, just because hopefully that's stuff that you covered in world history, but that kind of gives you a primer for like why World War One starts. Um, some of the important stuff about the war is you just need to know. I mean, World War One is going to be this very interesting conflict because um, they're going to fight with like these new technologies that were developed in the late 1800s and early 1900s with industrialization, but they hadn't really adjusted their fighting methods yet. And so this is important because like in the early parts of the war, they're still trying to use old sort of military tactics where you just like try to overwhelm your enemy with force. The problem is you know, and as I say, kind of like on the slide here, is that you can't just like charge into machine gun fire, and it doesn't really matter. You know, a couple people can easily mow down hundreds of people, and so like, you know, you can't just rely on brute force, and because of new technologies, and so like this is during World War One we start to see like this trench warfare develop. If any of you went and saw the Wonder Woman movie in the last 2 weeks, um, they actually show a scene where they walk through the trenches and they talk about like no man's land and how no man's land develops between trenches. But what's really relevant um, is you see like uh, you know, there were 1.1 million casualties over a 141-day period, and they only moved 6 miles. So basically a million people died for 6 miles of land, and so like what ends up happening is that like the war kind of stalls out because people are really horrified by how many people are dying in the early conflicts, and because they really have no idea what they're doing and how they're fighting, and so like um, you know that sort of Western Front. If you've read the book All Quiet on the Western Front, it talks about sort of like the horrors of trench warfare and all that kind of stuff. Um, Now, sort of getting to sort of the American side of this conflict is as this because this war originally they thought, well, like, hey, well, you know, we're gonna have this big glorious conflict and all the nations are gonna fight and there will be a winner and it will last 6 months and then it will be over. Um, the war ends up dragging on for 4 years. And so what ends up happening is that over the course of time, American businesses slowly get more and more sort of caught up in the conflict with selling munitions, selling guns, selling tanks, selling planes, basically, you know, food even. Um, Anything that these nations needed as they were going to war. Uh, it slowly starts to entangle the United States economically into the conflict. I mean, you see at the bottom, it says at least 21,000 new millionaires and billionaires made in the United States from World War One. And so, like, the United States gets very economically rich off this war, and that's really relevant because as people make more money, they become more entangled in the conflict, and eventually you get to a point where like we are so sort of entrenched in the conflict economically that Germany is going to kind of bring us in. Um, so how does this happen? Is sort of the big question. Um, I guess like the first part of this answer is just like because of like so that look just look at this map here, is that initially like the U.S. government was like U.S. companies can trade with any um, country that they please, and you know if you want to support Germany, you can support Germany. If you want to support the Allies, you can support the Allies, and then basically like you know, U.S. corporations have the freedom to trade whoever they want, and sort of help whatever side they want. And um, what ends up happening in reality, though, the problem with this is that like the British Navy was so strong, as you see that little like red loop around like the main German ports there, uh, in I don't know, is that the North Sea? Um, I think it is. But what's relevant there is that they sort of they create this blockade where like American ships couldn't get into trade with Germany, and so because the British blockade was so good, it really prevented non sort of you know it basically prevented most goods from getting into Germany, and so what effectively happens is that um, American corporations, like their ability to really trade with Germany in a substantial way, really is limited. And so what we see is that like American corporations, as the war sort of drags on, are really mostly trading with like the British government and the Allies. And so these the Germans before World War One developed what were called U-boats and just like underwater boats, um, as their submarines. And so the Germans didn't have a big enough navy to like just obviously create this huge naval blockade of England. I mean, they're an island, so that would be nearly impossible. Um, and what ends up happening is that um, you know, Germany can't prevent American ships from getting in, but what they do try to do is they try to just sink as many ships as they possibly can to intimidate people from trying to trade and like basically trying to prevent trade with Britain happening because they say like, hey, you have the chance to die, so maybe you don't want to trade with Britain. Um, and sort of like the pivotal moment here is in 1915 is a German submarine sank a passenger ship called the Lusitania, which had uh, I think roughly like 1,200 people on it, and what ends up happening as a result of that is, and then this is kind of like one of those messed up things is they don't tell you in history textbooks is like the American government and the British government were secretly using these passenger liner, like basically like cruise ships. They would use like the bottom layers of it to um, like ship like guns and munitions and war goods on these ships. And they thought, well, the Germans won't know about it. They'll just think it's people. They won't shoot these down. And so the Germans found out about it. Um, and warned the United States about this, and we continued to do it, and 1,200 innocent people got killed because of it. Now, at the time, and you can see that New York Times article at the time. At the time, I mean, people just thought the Germans were savages and that they were just like killing people innocently, and at the time, the people didn't know that, the government was trying to sneak these munitions onto these passenger ships, and that like Germany really honestly did have a reason to go after them. I mean, I'm not saying that sort of condones the killing of 1,200 innocent people, but um, it certainly wasn't what it was made to be in the press at the time. And so what ends up happening is that like America, this is one of those events where like American public like really strongly start to go against the Germans. Um, so after they sink the Lusitania, what's relevant here is that the Germans in the United States signed an agreement where they're like, hey, if you shoot down any more of our passenger ships, like we're going to go to war with you. And so the Germans say, okay, we'll stop shooting non-military vessels, and and that actually holds for about 2 years. What changes in 1917? There are two more things that really like eventually flipped the United States to being fully involved in the war. Is first is the Zimmerman telegram, or sometimes called the Zimmerman note, that the British sort of what was interesting actually is the British were spying on the United States, and so the British found out that Germany was trying to create an alliance with Mexico and basically like goad the Mexicans into attacking the United States. And they said, "Oh, hey, like if if you like this is Germany speaking, if you'll Mexico will join with us in this war against the United States and we win, like we'll give you all the territory that Americans stole from you in the Mexican-American War. So like you should know that like in the Mexican-American War in 1848." America basically goes like starts a war with Mexico, invades Mexico, goes all the way to Mexico City, and then forces the Mexicans to sign a treaty that they would sell us um, like New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, Utah, California, um, basically like the whole West and Southwest. And because we don't take anything, we said, well, we're going to force you to sell it to us for a price, which ended up being really cheap. But So like Germany's whole thing was like, hey, like if you come join this war against America with us, like we'll give you all the territory that they basically took from you back. And the British find out about this, and then they kind of stealthily kind of pass over that intelligence to the United States because they couldn't tell them straightforward because it was like, hey, we got this by spying on you guys, and we came across this. Um, but uh, and that's kind of a more complicated story than I'm making it, but that's sort of like a simple version. But they basically pass it over to the United States. So like when that comes to light, that basically Germany was trying to get Mexico to attack the United States, that even strengthens anti-German sentiment in America. And then secondly, also in 1917, the Germans decided that they were going to go back to unrestricted submarine warfare, where they just started sinking all and any ship that was headed for Britain. And so like those two things um, finally sort of flip um, America towards uh, the Allied side, and eventually sort of like cause America to declare war against Germany in 1917. Um, I also like the sort of pessimist in me also like wants to make sure that you're fully aware of that. Um, as the war dragged on, I don't think we can discount this, and I think this is important to note. Is as the war dragged on, American financial institutions and American corporations started to hold, because of how much they were trading with Britain, like the British government started to owe American corporations, American government, huge amounts of money, massive amounts of money, and similarly in France, but not to the same extent. So the America, if the British were to lose and France were to lose, that they would probably default on their these massive loans that they had taken out and all this money that they had borrowed from American banks and had sort of owed to American corporations, would be lost. And I think like that's something to be really sort of conscious of, is that it became at some point in this conflict really vital for the Allies to win for American the health of the American economy. Um, Once we do decide to join, um, we really needed to quickly increase the size of our army. Um, I think like the stat is something, and I don't know this off the top of my head, but I know it's somewhere in this range. I think like at this, when World War I started, we had like the 50th or somewhere in that range, like the 50th biggest army in the world. Um, and so like if you put that in perspective, I mean it's like Romania had a bigger army than the United States, and so like we quickly realized like, okay, we're really inadequately prepared to fight in a conflict. And so what Congress does is they pass what was called the Select Service Act, which all of you sort of young men in the room are probably sort of keenly aware of, because you probably had to sign up for the Select Service Act when you got your driver's license. Um, is that like basically what it did is the Select Service Act created like the draft, and so all men 18 and older had to sign up for the Select Service and could be drafted into the military. And so um, this is something that we really quickly figure out. And I think this is what I was trying to allude to earlier in the war, is earlier in the lecture, uh, is that this is really the important thing, is that like the war is really going to drastically change the role of government. And I think honestly, like thinking about your test for World War I, I think that this is one of the questions, is that like understanding that like the government becomes much, much, much more involved in the economy, um, in that the war really is the impetus for like a centralization of government power in the economy and government control of the economy and government regulation. So we see like that they create federal agencies to make sure that people were creating enough food, they were producing more gas and oil, to make sure that railroads were properly priced so that like goods could get from factories to ships on the seaboard. Um, so you start to see like they also created a War Industries Board, which like regulated war-related businesses to like try to increase like their production levels, so that we make sure that we were creating enough bullets and make sure we creating enough guns and enough canned food and enough uniforms and enough boots and all that stuff. And so like essentially what this is like government basically goads these different sectors of our economy into to increase output greatly. Um, and we'll kind of see the effects of this as a reactionary in like the 1920s, and we'll talk about how like the 1920s really um, like the government kind of backs off the pedal, so to speak, and but uh, the 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 movement had already sort of been started, and that like this is really going to help sort of drive huge economic growth in the 1920s. Um, it also is going to change the role of women and minorities, so women are going to help take factory jobs as men go off to fight. That's pretty straightforward. One of the things that I really just want to make a note of is that this role that women play in World War One is really important for the women's suffrage movement, with like women getting the right to vote, which you should have read in uh, yesterday's chapter about the progressive movement and how like women's suffrage sort of pushes through, and eventually like after World War One is over, uh, we passed the 19th Amendment in America that gave women the right to vote finally. Um, the others that like groups of people that fill in as men largely go off to fight in war is that like blacks and Mexicans do find work in factories in many places where they hadn't found work before. They also, in large numbers, I mean, go to help fight on the battlefield. And I think in some ways, like this, uh, like their role in factories and in the battlefield and I say temporarily because what's going to happen is that when those white men come back from war and want their factory jobs back, there's a lot of conflict between whites and blacks, and this like helps like those race riots that we talked about. For example, a lot of them were over jobs and housing and things like that as these soldiers were coming back home. Um, the other big thing that like the American government changes during World War One um, is starts to really dive into propaganda building. During World War One, the government created what was called the Committee on Public Information, or CPI, and all they do is basically like create millions of pamphlets that would get printed and circulated around America that would try to um, get Americans to feel certain ways or to act in certain ways. Um, like you see here, like they're trying to get people to buy U.S. bonds, which would help the government raise money to fight the war. Or they would tell them like you to eat less wheat so that they would have more food for soldiers to fight war. You can see other examples here, just like trying to get men to enlist in the war, and so like the government becomes really critically involved in like the war effort and trying to like brainwash people into like acting and thinking the way that they want them to think, that like the Germans are the evil people and need to be stopped, um, and so I think that's important. Now, not everyone sort of goes along with this. Like the draft was very controversial, and drafts in basically every American war have been controversial. Maybe outside of World War II, I think is really the only war you could say that like there weren't draft riots and draft protests really happening in large numbers. Um, and I think like this war, especially because like um, they could kind of see like this is the rich man's war, and like this, there's no clear reason for American troops to go and fight in Europe's war. And um, what ends up happening as a result, I mean, you have such large levels of like discontent with the government and like sending kids off to fight. The government actually had to pass um, the Espionage and Sedition Acts, which literally during World War One, it made it a crime to speak out against the war or the government, which I hope you kind of realize is um, as part of like what makes America special is like that, both in good times and bad, like we have the freedom to, voice our minds in opposition to what's happening, and then like that's part of free speech, whether you sort of like it or what people are saying or not. Um, but like Congress enacted laws here during World War One because of the protests that made it criminal to sort of speak out against World War One and or to speak out against the American government, what they were doing during World War One. You could get heavily fined. You could get sent to prison. Um, and one of the more famous Supreme Court cases happens during this, like in opposition to those Espionage and Sedition Acts, is that like in Schenck versus the United States, a man sued the government over these sort of sedition laws, like these anti-free speech laws. Um, and what the Supreme Court ruled is that like the government does have a right to suppress your freedom of speech when it could possibly harm others. And they'll say like during during a war that the government does have the right to because of the sort of safety of people in the country to like suppress opposition, which I think is tenuous at best. What's actually interesting is that to me they kind of like build a scarecrow argument here is and sort of dodge the real question. Um, the example that they give like free speech isn't like absolute. They say like, well, like if you walked into a packed movie theater and you screamed fire when there wasn't a fire, um, and people got trampled on the way out and maybe someone died, is like that you should be held responsible for that, like that speech that caused other people harm when it wasn't true. um and I think like, yeah, like I agree with that, but at the same time like this court case is really interesting to me because like to me that's not the same thing as like going um you know to in front of like the draft board office and like protesting or writing um, and circulating like anti-war materials and things like that. Um, so I think that's interesting. I really do. And we'll kind of continue to talk about that because World War One sort of unique in that aspect. Um, and you'll read something in class actually tomorrow that does talk a lot about those sort of protests. What we see, so like by the fall of 1918, the German front's collapsing. You see like a abandoned German uh, front there, and you can sort of see all the trenches that they had built and the sort of elaborate system of trenches that they had developed. Um, and what ends up happening is like that the Germans at the very end of the conflict make sort of like one last push to win, um, and they end up sort of not obviously being successful in this attack, and so what they end up doing is like that because they're unsuccessful, the sort of German front starts to deteriorate. Germans are also like running desperately low on supplies, food, munitions, all that kind of stuff, and so they sue for peace. And this is really like the interesting thing is that, and we'll talk about how like World War One ends is really interesting. All right, so as you sort of see here, in this is, I wish I would word this differently. What happens is that the Germans sue for peace. Like using the word surrender is not necessarily the right word to use. Certainly, like the Allies had the sort of advantage in that, like it was definitely one side was trying to make a peace agreement, knowing full well that they had sort of lost their sort of edge and lost their ability to really win the war. And um, so the Allies definitely had the sort of power. But what I think is really interesting is that like this peace treaty that gets developed, and we'll talk about this later, is like they basically make a peace treaty without consulting the Germans about it at all, and it's very vindictive and has a lot of problems. But um, it's World War One's interesting, and I don't think there's really any other conflict that's ever ended like this. But like when the Germans sued for peace, and that's why I say surrender is a really bad word to use. Um, when the Germans sued for peace, the Germans are actually in French territory, and so like I'm really struggling to think of like another time in history where like a country that was occupying lands of another country decided that they were going to sue for peace, and it made sense for the Germans. I mean, don't get me wrong. The Germans were going to lose this war, and like I said, after they make that sort of last ditch effort to try to win, they realize they don't have the numbers or the strength to win, and especially with America getting involved in even in the smallest ways, um, does make a difference. And so we'll get to that later, but I just think like that's something that's been like it's super interesting like history thing. If we look at sort of how many people die from the war, um, you have roughly like 20 million people that die from the war, all told. Um, and I think what's interesting is that uh, the psychological effect of like 20 million people dying during the war and the huge amount of devastation and destruction that happens as a result of this really has a psychological effect on the world. Uh, they called the sort of writers after World War One sort of like the lost generation, and like after World War One, we see a huge growth in like existentialism and these sort of philosophical movement to like question what life is all about and why we're here and if there really is any sort of meaning or purpose to this. And so like it we'll talk about this like the next lecture in the 1920s about how um, World War One does really have a profound effect on like the psyche of Western society, both in Europe and the United States. Um, if we look at sort of like the Treaty of Versailles, okay, because the Treaty of Versailles is the treaty that's going to end up being the treaty that ends World War One, is President Wilson's going to travel. Like this becomes so important for Wilson that he travels to Versailles, France, um, and I think like and think about this and think about how and even in an age where there's so much less technology, so his ability to really run the country is that much more limited. I think he was gone for like 6 months, if I remember correctly. Like the president was literally in Versailles negotiating this peace treaty himself for like 6 months, and this was important because like what Wilson saw is like that this war was avoidable, and so for like Wilson, if the international sort of scene had certain rules and regulations and organizations to prevent things like this, that World War One would have never happened. And you can kind of see like he develops a plan called the 14 points, and for obvious reasons because his plan had 14 different parts to it. Um, I think like if we look at like the next slide, the points that are most important like in his 14 points, um, keep going here, is that he wanted countries to reduce like their militaries. He wanted countries to trade with each other because he thought like, hey, countries that trade together don't fight each other. He thought that like, that there should be no secret alliances. He thought that countries should scale back colonialism and so they wouldn't be fighting over colonies. And he wanted to establish that last one there. He wanted to establish a League of Nations, which the League of Nations is like the first version of the United Nations. And we'll talk about this because the League of Nations ends up being a failure. And what's interesting is actually like the League of Nations gets created, and it's an American idea, and America never actually joins the League of Nations. And we'll talk about why that happens here in a second. So if we look at this, Wilson had his 14 points. And it was kind of easy because Wilson wanted to take it easy on Germany. He wanted to like sort of build friendships with Germany so that like he thought of like, hey, friends don't go to war with each other. The other leaders in Versailles, so like both French and British leaders in Versailles wanted to punish Germany, and they wanted Germany to pay for the destruction of the war. You can see like this is an image of a French city after World War One. I mean, in many and many cities looked this way. Uh, so Wilson's basically like 14 points get sort of tossed aside, um, and oops, sorry, uh, Wilson's 14 points get sort of rejected, and they even though they create the League of Nations, I guess that's like one thing that does stick. But like at the Treaty of Versailles, they decide um, to punish Germany. Okay, and so Germany's going to have to pay very large reparations payments. Um, Germany has to give up land. They write certain stipulations into the Treaty of Versailles that like the German um, army, the Germans can't have a military. It's there's all sorts of crazy stuff in it. Like they go to great extremes to punish Germany for this, World War One. It also, like you can see, like from the Treaty of Versailles, they're going to create a whole bunch of new countries. So like Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Czechoslovakia. They break the Austro-Hungarian Empire into Austria, Hungary, Romania, and Yugoslavia. They break up the Ottoman Empire, which we should have talked about in world history, and how like the Ottoman Empire sort of disintegrates into Turkey. They create Syria, Iraq, Iran, all those countries. Um, so when Wilson comes back to the United States with this very butchered um, Treaty of Versailles, um, the U.S. Senate was very firmly against the Treaty of Versailles because the Senate didn't want the United States to join the League of Nations. They thought that the League of Nations would get America like entangled in European conflicts and world conflicts that we didn't necessarily want to be involved in. And that like this League of Nations would be like something that would be very bad for America. And as you know, like so like in the Constitution it says that like the president has the power to negotiate treaties, but for a treaty to get approved, it needs to be confirmed or like passed by the U.S. Senate. And so like what happens is like Wilson is very unwilling to compromise on this treaty. Um, and he goes on this like massive um, sort of speaking tour around the United States to try to promote the League of Nations, and he actually suffers a stroke during that. Um, and what's interesting about that is like actually like in the last, uh, I think it's like 8 months of Wilson's presidency, like he had suffered a stroke and really wasn't able to be president, and so his wife was really making all of um, decisions and helping him run the country, and no one really knew that he was incapacitated. So the Senate's eventually going to refuse to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. Therefore, like by refusing to ratify the peace treaty, the U.S. is never going to join the League of Nations, which I said is ironic because it was an American idea. We'll talk about like sort of the ramifications of that later on. If we look at sort of the big effects of World War One, we're definitely going to see like a new world order emerge, especially because like as you see, like we already talked about empires breaking up. But like that big one that I have in the red there is that like the United States is going to become the world's economic center, is going to shift really from London to New York, and the United States is going to become the largest creditor nation in the world. And what that means is like basically the United States was the World Bank. Like we were like United States banks and financial institutions were loaning, were where people went to get loans, and that's really important. If we look at some of these, like coming down from the war wasn't like all peaches, because what we see is like as like American, even though America like was unscathed by the war, at least physically speaking, because of like you can see the picture on the left there where many European cities were destroyed. What's going to happen is there's a number of sort of things that get in the way, and the first is, and this is huge, and I don't know how much it talks about this in your book, but like the Spanish flu epidemic, the Spanish flu epidemic that happens at the end of World War One actually killed five times more people than World War One did. So if you think about that, this is a really scary thing for people in the world at the time. it closes down schools. I mean, many cities close down sort of temporarily. Um, you know, uh, Professional sports. I mean, like people basically like it's such a deadly thing that people stop going outside, and it's all around the world. So like, it's called the Spanish flu because they sort of falsely attributed it to Spanish soldiers, and actually like new science is showing that it may have actually originated in the United States. Um, but this Spanish flu spreads all over the world. It kills many. I think like upwards now they're saying like upwards of like 100 million people die because of this. Because they're constantly changing this number as they find out more and more about this. Um, there's also a number of economic problems because we go through a huge recession after the war, because as um, the war slows down, there's less of a need for goods. The U.S. economy had gotten used to producing all of these things for these warring countries, and once the war stops, the economy has to shift back to like a peacetime economy, and that sort of shift causes lots of problems and causes huge inflation to happen in um, um, the United States. We talked about race riots yesterday, so I won't get into that deeply. But like I said earlier, it's like as soldiers return home and struggle to find jobs, and in some ways sometimes find like women and minorities in their jobs, it does cause problems, especially with race riots all over the country. Um, I also think like this is going to be interesting. You're gonna, and again, you're gonna read about this tomorrow in class. This little short reading, um, is that because of rising prices, are going to make it harder to make ends. We start to see that like union membership becomes more and more people start joining unions. Um, and many unions are going to go on strike during this time period. I think, like in 1919 alone, more than 4 million workers went on strike, which is a huge number of people. That like basically, and just to give you some examples of this, like basically the whole city of Seattle goes on strike at one point. Boston Police Department goes on strike, and we get to this point where uh, like many people viewed the strikes start to view the strikes as being like un-American, because it's like, hey, like like this next political cartoon is like, you see Uncle Sam saying, and just when I had such an advantage in the start of the race for world markets, we're closed. So like they kind of see that like um, labor's like workers and labor unions are getting in the way of like American prosperity, and like these unions are like anti-American and are unpatriotic and like are actually like harming America. So we start to see like a very sort of anti um, union, and it already in some ways already had been in place since the late 1800s, but it really intensified, like anti-unionism really intensifies in this period right after World War One. The other big thing that we see right after World War One is what was called like the Red Scare, and the Red Scare is really important because it's like you should know that like during World War One, Russia goes through its communist revolution. So like during the war, Russia becomes communist, and people start to like equate like the growth in unions and immigrants and like all this like anti-American stuff with also like with socialism and communism. And people become very scared that like communism is going to take over the United States, and that the United States is going to become this communist country. Um, and so uh, you should sort of understand that like there's going to be two red scares in American history. Like one's going to be right after World War One, one's going to be right after World War Two. It's really easy to remember in that way. Um, but sort of that like this fear of communism is going to cause like a growth in anti-immigrant sort of feelings in America, um, and certainly increase anti-union sort of. They start to equate like unions with communism and communist groups, and so that's obviously people become very anti-union. Um, and part of this is what I don't. We kind of jump over the Palmer raids. Attorney General gets a bomb sent to his house, and um, what we see is like that. Then the country sort of goes around, sort of arresting all these immigrants, and many of these people were deported without even getting a trial. So it's kind of this very shaky, um, like unconstitutional thing, and it's just like they're targeting uh, immigrants. Um, I also think like this is another good example of Sacco and Vanzetti, where like you just start to like this is a really good example of like how like people become very anti-immigrant, um, and like these two guys, uh, there was really very little real evidence against that these guys had committed a murder. I mean, I think if you sort of read about this, um, the actual account sort of given to the police of like these murderers was that they looked Italian, and so they go and they find these two guys that were had been associated with radical groups. They basically put them on trial. They convict them, um, even though there, like I said, there was virtually no evidence that that was actually them. But because they're immigrants and because they had been sort of loosely tied to radical groups, is that they put them on trial, they found them guilty and execute them. And so like that's a sort of one of those things that's like just kind of shows how sort of like because of this sort of Red Scare and the effects of the Red Scare is that we become very gets taken out on immigrants. And we'll talk about this lastly. All of this chaos at the end of World War One and certainly in the transition after World War One. The election of 1920, the first year that women actually could vote, Warren G. Harding gets elected president, sort of claiming or promising a return to normalcy. And we'll talk about his presidency tomorrow. So